to welcome our new members for agreeing to serve on this committee. This is my first time as chair of this committee, so please be gentle with me. If I can just start by confirming the membership of the committee. So my name is Councillor John Taylor. I'm chairing this committee. I'll ask the other members if they can just briefly introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'm Councillor James Homewood from Ashbrow Ward. I'm also a member of the committee.
Hi, I'm Chris Jones. I'm the independent member of the committee.
Hi, Councillor Imran Safdar, new member of the committee in Crosslandmore. Thank you.
And Caroline online, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yep, I'm Caroline, the Conservative member for Liversedge and Gomersall. Thank you. Have we received any apologies?
Yes, we've received apologies from Councillor Sewell, Councillor Pinnock, Councillor Scott and Councillor Armour.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to minutes of the previous meeting. So minutes of the previous meeting have been circulated. Are people happy to approve those minutes? I'm guessing I'm looking at Chris and James, who would have been. Oh. Okay. Right. Well, we'll take those minutes as approved. Thank you. Just ask members if they have any declarations of interest to declare. That's all right. Come and join us up front. Councillor Paula Davis has just joined the meeting as well. If members... and Councillor Davis is subbing for Councillor Kath Pinnock. Thank you. Declarations of interest. If anybody has any declarations of interest, they have an opportunity to declare them now. If during the meeting you suddenly realise perhaps there's something you wish to declare, feel free to raise that at the time. In your pack, you'll have a form to complete if you do have a declaration of interest. You can pass that to Nicola at the end of the meeting. Thank you. So I'll move on to item 4, admissions to the public. I think we're taking everything in the public domain. People are okay with that? Yep. Okay. Item 5, deputations and petitions.
None received, Chair.
Thank you. Right. Well, we're swiftly on to item 6, and I'm going to ask Chris Reid if he would introduce this item, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just thought I'd introduce myself because I know that there's new members here. So I'm Chris Reid, I'm Corporate Customer Standards Officer. We're a small team of just over 3 FTEs. We deal with corporate complaints, which is complaints where they haven't been resolved at service level. And we also liaise with the local government ombudsman. There are other complaints, formal appeals and things like children's complaints and housing complaints. They go through a different process. I am sort of looking to draw that information into the Corporate Governance and Audit Committee arena, you know, for the reports that I produce. But at the moment, it's a little bit patchy, so that's a work in progress. The big thing, I suppose, that I wanted to talk about this time is the Local Government Ombudsman Code, which is a consistent way of complaints handling for every council, which is due to be introduced in April 2026. So that will require us to make some changes to our complaints procedure. Not least a 2-stage complaints process. At the moment, we have a 3-stage complaints process, but there is a synergy actually with the Ombudsman's Code in that they have a pre-assessment looking at something which could be akin to our stage 1. So I think it's sort of rebranding and rebadging what we do a little bit to sort of make it fit the Ombudsman's Code. So there's some work to be done there. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of looking at timescales and monitoring. So there's quite a big area there. And there's also a member that has to be responsible for complaints handling, who I think would be a cabinet member. So that has to be set up as well. So it's due to be introduced in April 26, so we do have some time. And the other thing to notice is that the Ombudsman's actually picked some trial councils to do some introduction work, and they're going to report back early in 2025. So actually it's quite important that perhaps we don't have too much of a fixed process at this point, because it may change, there may be alterations through. So I'm not saying ignore it, we're not going to sit on our laurels and do nothing, but on the other hand, we're also not going to have something that's completely fixed at a very early point, so that we can sort of pick up any learning from other councils. So that's the sort of plan. So the customer standards statement is the other thing that we're looking at. So we used to have a customer standards document which was withdrawn around 2010, 2011 when austerity kicked in, because at that point it was quite a prescriptive document. Standards were, you know, answer calls within 5 rings and that sort of stuff, and we couldn't necessarily commit to that sort of standard. After that time, we did introduce something which was called a customer promise, which was a softer set of skills that we expected our staff to sort of work towards, which was giving advice to customers, explaining why that their request was perhaps not being dealt with in the way that they anticipated, and signposting them on to further advice and information. So it was kind of like a good practice sort of thing for our frontline staff, and that I think is incorporated in our induction training and all that sort of stuff to this day, although it doesn't appear on the internet. Now, because we were working on looking at the complaints process, we also felt it was appropriate to look at a customer standards, and the Chief Exec was quite keen on having a customer standards, and then it would lead on to the complaints process. So that was kind of the thinking behind it. So I'm looking to develop something, and I know we spoke earlier on this week at Chair's briefing, and we are talking about obviously making sure that Corporate Governance and Audit Committee have sight of that draft document that we're producing, so that you can input into it and have a look at it. And it's not really a finished product. I think the idea is that we have something there that's on the internet, as every other council has, but then it would actually be developed over time as we move forward, and perhaps some of our plans that we've got rolling forward the next couple of years have firmed up a little bit, so that we're in a better position to know exactly what we can offer and that sort of stuff. So it was really just an idea to get a start together on that. So that's that part of it. And in terms of the report, the other thing that I report on is performance. So what happens is I attend Corporate Governance and Audit twice a year. I have an interim report, which is this report, and then I have a full report, which comes out around September time. The Local Government Ombudsman publishes an annual report every July, and I follow on from that. So it's appropriate for me to use the Ombudsman's wording, for example, in the report, so it's independent rather than my interpretation of what's happened, which is a bit more what the interim report is about. So I give a view on where I think we are. In terms of 23-24, in terms of Ombudsman complaints, we actually consistently receive fewer complaints than we might expect for our population. So it is quite a positive story in Kirklees. And also we get fewer upheld complaints than we might expect per population, and that's detailed in the report there. I've done West Yorkshire as a comparison. Last year I also did Manchester and South Yorkshire as comparables, and we kind of came round hovering around the top quartile, just outside the top quartile in terms of performance indicators. So there's obviously more to be done, but on the other hand we're not laggards in this sort of area, so it is quite positive overall. In terms of the third stage complaint numbers, we're back to long-term averages in 23-24. We actually had a dip in 22-23, quite a considerable dip. But unfortunately, we've had increased numbers, particularly in 2 areas of the council's activities. One of them relates to SEND, which is a national issue in terms of increasing numbers coming through for SEND applications, shortages of educational psychologists to actually prepare the report, and that sort of stuff. And I know that outside in other committees, the SEND position is being quite closely monitored in Kirklees, as I'm sure it is in other councils as well. The other area that we got an increase in is refuse complaints, and as members will probably remember, just before Christmas there was a bit of a double hit in terms of changing the rounds and also changing the wagons, which caused some issues with collections and that sort of stuff, and that takes a while to feed through into the complaints process. So we are sort of perhaps at the end of looking at refuse collection complaints that sort of arise from that little period when we had a blip. So again, both of those are quite well known about and documented elsewhere. In terms of learning from complaints, I think it's quite reassuring actually that when you look at the list of learning that it's quite standard issues, and I would expect that from a good local authority, in terms that if I was picking up things that the service hadn't picked up, then that would be a concern. So if you think about it, that I'm review beyond service stage, then obviously it appears that issues are being picked up at service stage. So if there are policy issues that need addressing, in the main they are being addressed at service level, which is what you'd expect. So the routine, they're fairly routine, and I'm not discounting actually, you know, what the complainant received at the end of it, but the actual learning from it is fairly routine. It's things like delay in responding and not explaining yourself clearly and that sort of stuff. So that's it, really. I don't think I want to add anything else. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'll open it up now to members, if anybody would like to comment. James, you were first, then Chris.
Yeah, thanks. So two comments on the different parts, really. So just firstly on the ombudsman stuff and the 2 stages. I know we're at early days on that, and you mentioned that we don't jump ahead, but does that have any impact on, or could that potentially have an impact on how we deal with complaints quickly and at the first point of contact? Because one of my concerns would be that the best case scenario is if somebody makes a complaint and the person who receives that complaint goes, yeah, let me fix that now. There's something's gone wrong, I can fix it. What we don't want that is to go in, you don't really want that to go into a big backlog of, into a case review, into 5 days for an acknowledgement, 10 days to be investigated for something that could be dealt with there. So I guess it's how we make sure that still works properly, because we don't, you know, I wouldn't want people to have to go through a long process when something can be resolved straight away. And then the second thing I just wanted to ask was about the findings from the complaints and the sections around, you mentioned around communications and talked about the refuse services and stuff. One of my reflections would be that I think communication is one of the areas for me, and I wonder how, from looking at those complaints, how we can make improvements there. Because I guess it's not just looking at how we dealt with complaints, but how we can stop those complaints from happening in the first place. And I know we always focus on refuge because it's one that we hear a lot about as members, and obviously everybody in the borough uses the refuse service. And one of the things that I found is the main complaint I get from residents is that sometimes they get different answers when they speak to different people on an issue, like why is the bin not collected? And when there was the issues with the changes to the rounds and collection vehicles and stuff, when I spoke to the officers, they gave me quite, this is what we're looking at, this is the problem in this particular street, this is what we're looking at, this is what we want to resolve, this is what we want the residents to do. And when I said, well, has anyone actually spoken to the residents about any of this? It appeared to me they hadn't. So how is the resident supposed to know that, you know, for example, leave your bin out to be collected the next day if nobody tells them that? How are they supposed to know that actually if they move the bin to the front of the property rather than the rear, for example, that it might get collected if nobody tells them that? So I just think learning from that, and that's just one example, I'm sure it applies to others, how can we, from those complaints, you know, not just think about how we can deal with the actual complaints, what's to come in better, but to prevent the complaints in the first place, because I think, particularly in refuge, that's one that I still think I haven't seen that level of improvement yet.
Thank you. Yes, good, interesting points, both of those. Yeah, the first thing is that we have been working on restorative practice. And that is exactly as you say, it's actually sort of identifying the issues and then looking to address them immediately or as quickly as possible. And some services are, I suppose in a sense I've worked with some services more than I have others as well, so I don't want to blame services for this. But what we are trying to do is to get services to really look at how the Ombudsman might remedy something. And the Ombudsman actually publishes a list of sort of suitable remedies and situations and scenarios. It also publishes every single case that it views and makes a decision on. So there's thousands of cases that you can search on the Ombudsman's website to actually try and come up with a comparable situation and then see how the Ombudsman has addressed it. So I think the Ombudsman Code, it does set out a almost like a template for response, which is more consistent than what we have at the moment. So things like apologies and stuff like that will be automatically built in there, and I think it can occasionally be easy for the officer to forget to apologise. You know, they have it in their head, but what they write doesn't add it, so the letter could be better. So that consistency will help. And the other thing is that I certainly want to do more work working with services to actually think about them being more active in terms of, and having the confidence really to say, well, actually, I think the Ombudsman would offer a £200 time and trouble payment for this, and actually doing it. But of course, against that, what we don't want to have is a culture where we buy customers off at public expense. So it is that balance between making sure that we pick it up quickly, but we don't overuse it just to, oh, I'm really busy, so I'm going to give this person £500 and they go away. You know, that's not that's not what we're after. So you know, and it's just sort of working out how we monitor and deal with that. So I think that's a useful point. And I think there will be stuff coming through on that one. In terms of the second one, I think sometimes when you get to third stage, the complaints, I would say, that they're quite small in number. So we have perhaps 1 million transactions in the council. I've plucked that out of the air, but you think of all the telephone calls and the visits and the conversations that you have, absolutely loads. I look at about 90. So, you know, in comparison, it's quite a small representative sample of the whole. So I do have to be a little bit guarded about what I can infer from a complaint and from the work that I do. And the other thing is that my work is perhaps slewed by hard to please, very persistent complainants, people with you know, maybe a grudge against the council or something that puts in a complaint. So we have those as well in our cohort, if you like. So it can be quite difficult to sort of form too much of a view by it. And I think the issue is the age-old problem. When you're busy, you don't have time to communicate. So if you start getting a service that starts spiralling out of control a little bit for a period, then it's very difficult to update and let people know. So the refuse team, for example, they did some sterling work a couple of years ago in introducing a customer service team, which actually more monitored missed bin collections and things like making sure repeat missed bin collections were clocked and things like that, where they weren't done so much before. So they've done a good job, but obviously what happened in November was that they just got completely overwhelmed, basically, because there was an awful lot of stuff coming through that they weren't able to respond to. So that's always going to be an issue with whichever service you're talking about. If it goes out of control, it's quite difficult to sort of then keep everybody updated. But I'd say they've certainly done some work. And the other thing that they are working on, I know, is making sure that the in-cab IT works a lot better and is consistently used as well. So if bins are missed and that sort of stuff, that it's better recorded and better monitored, so they can start doing stuff about it. So I will feed back what you've said to the refuse team, but I know that there is some work ongoing. But I'll certainly feed that in as well, so that they can sort of certainly perhaps get in touch and sort of let you know a little bit more about what they're doing. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Do you want to come back, James? Chris?
Thanks for the report, Chris. It's really good read, as always. And I agree with you that 81 third stage complaints, given the size and complexity of the council, is spectacularly good. I don't know actually whether I'd be happier with 150 complaints if we learnt more from it. And that's always a challenge with complaints, isn't it? They're a learning opportunity, can be a rich resource. But I guess if we got 150, we'd be saying, why have we got 150 and we should only have 80? That's the nature of committees, isn't it? I was a little less enthusiastic about the kind of percentage of help data, recognising its small numbers. I think we're a third out of 5 in West Yorkshire, and your comment about Wakefield does have a better complaints performance made me wonder if we should be looking at Wakefield, whatever that means, and seeing if we can get better still, having flagged that as a strong performer on our patch. I'd always prefer us to compare ourselves with best in class nationally, not just West Yorkshire, but you tried that last year. I think we've expanded the patch to Greater Manchester, so don't repeat that just for me, but I think generally it's good to compare us with the best. And I just wondered whether now is time, given what's coming with the code, to address the absence of a corporate collection process. Because that's where all the learning is, isn't it, really? If we could do that really, really well, and not just have a report on 81, but have a report on 810, that might enrich our learning and our understanding of risk and our understanding of what's going wrong in services and how that might impact on Martin's plan or the corporate governance statement or whatever it feels it's a potential resource of information. But I recognise it's a hugely difficult challenge. So I think it's something to just bear in mind as we move towards adopting that new code. Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, again, two very helpful points, I think, there. I haven't actually analysed what Wakefield do recently. I know when I spoke with them perhaps a decade ago, they had kind of like 9 FTEs working on it. So it was a rather different setup. And councils do it quite differently. So some people have legal officers, for example, that deal with complaints at third stage. I'm an accountant by training, not a legal officer. You know, and again, I think if you had a legal officer, it would be a different approach and a different response. So it's quite difficult sometimes. You are comparing apples and pears occasionally. And likewise, the best in class. I did sort of identify a couple of councils. I think one of them was in South Yorkshire, name escapes me at the minute, but that consistently perform quite well. But I think, it's not always consistent, because you do get, I don't know, a council decides to issue permits for their waste tip or something, and their complaints go up through the roof, as ours did a few years ago. So it's kind of quite difficult to say you're consistently really good. So some years you have some that are better than others. So it's kind of quite hard. But that said, Wakefield, for example, they are very often have a very low number of complaints. So they do. Yeah, they do that sort of stuff. The Ombudsman as well is kind of looking at those cases and almost acknowledging those situations where we have remedied things suitably before it gets to the Ombudsman. The conundrum is, of course, if we've remedied it suitably and made the customer happy, they never go to the Ombudsman, so the Ombudsman actually never knows that we've remedied it. But so it's only those that are unhappy with our remedy, even though the Ombudsman's happy with our remedy, that they manage to count. So that's a slightly strange one. And again, in terms of the corporate collection process, I agree entirely. The issue that we have, as I say, we're 3 FTEs and we've got a change process in place. We are looking to improve our corporate collection and sort of make sure that we record things much more rigorously and also draw in some sort of service learning, but it's going to be an incremental process. Unfortunately, we don't have a whiz-bang complaints computer system that everybody keys in and I can sort of sit there as a super controller and press a button and get reports out of it. We just don't have anything like that. So it is sort of individual pockets. And what I find is that those services that I suppose need a complaints monitoring system, like planning, for example, they tend to have one, you know, so if there is a lot of complaints, they recognise for themselves. So I need to do more work in terms of tapping into what they are finding and obviously reporting that back to Corporate Governance and Audit Committee. So I think that's a useful point. Yeah, thank you.
Chris? Okay.
Fine, thank you.
Paula?
Yeah, thank you. This is really interesting to me, because this is complaints is what I deal with a lot in my outside of my council work. So what's interesting to me is, although the third stage complaints and the Ombudsman investigations are typically low, for me it would be interesting to see the pyramid of complaints below that and the whole iceberg of if services are self-reporting their first level complaints at the moment, to see what percentage of those by department then translate through to. And then sort of like it's easier. It's good to see whether good work is being done in a department because they're resolving those first issues. Because as we know, it's the communication of those first level complaints that stops it becoming, and a well handled initial complaint stops it becoming even further. I think most issues, like the rest of my colleagues here, will be that I get more complaints about complaints not being responded or acknowledged, and that's the frustration that residents have, than actually the issue that's wrong. So that understanding of, like from a and then sharing learning across the services, a team that works really well. And waste, despite the issues, they do deal with things well. How they respond quickly and acknowledge is maybe a good way to do it. It's just some more learning that can be done. It's interesting to see how it's going. It's great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Another good point, and I do know that waste colleagues, they do have a computer system which sort of records and acknowledges complaints, and they did find that from the time that they first came into being a couple of years ago to about sort of 8 months later, that I think they reduced the level of complaints that move from second to third stage from 17% to about 9% or something like that. So they did see some real gains in terms of just having those staff there actually sort of giving feedback to residents and that sort of stuff. So yeah, I would like to do a little bit more on that and sort of trying to identify exactly feeding through. And likewise, one thing, and I had a eureka moment the other day, which is a bit surprising after 15 years in the role, but it was around third stage moving on to ombudsman and actually monitoring how many of my third stages go on to ombudsman. It's not pure, unfortunately, because the ombudsman deals with some cases that doesn't go through the third stage process, so it's not a watertight sort of process, unfortunately, but it would be interesting just to see the different conclusions that the Ombudsman makes. And we do clock it on an individual level. We look at it and think, oh God, I missed that, or oh, yeah, the Ombudsman said exactly what I've said. But yes, it'd be useful to have that sort of recorded so that we can sort of test that system. So yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you for the comprehensive report, Chris. Very impressive. What concerns me, obviously, there's lots of concerns, but I know you're working incredibly hard. The number of send complaints. It says here the team are working through a backlog of cases. And obviously, I do sympathise with the national shortage of educational psychologists. I've come across this issue in dealing with various family members and residents who are waiting for EHCP referrals and documentation. But what exactly are we doing to help those very stressed parents and carers through this procedure? So is there special kind of compassionate care and kind of a bit of partnership going on between your officers and the parents who are, for lack of a better term, very, very stressed right now?
I will have to go back to the service and check on that. I know at the moment what we are getting, I suppose, is that they're actually sort of working through cases. So we are getting an increased number of assessments coming through, which in a sense is, say 10% of them prompt a complaint. Well, we're getting more complaints purely because more are coming through the pipework in a funny sense. So it's a symptom of actually producing more work that we're getting some complaints through. But you are also correct in terms that people are still waiting unacceptably long delays for things. And I'm not sure how the service are actually sort of managing the individual expectations there. I know that senior managers in certain circumstances have met with some very concerned parents. So there is a mechanism whereby the more concerned parents certainly get sort of face-to-face discussion with the senior managers on the section. But yes, I will double check on that. Thank you.
Do you want to come back?
Thank you for that clarification. And I know it may be a different department, but if you could maybe email me, drop me an email how to engage with the officers working on the backlog, because some of my residents have concerns about language and translation and understanding the system. So if you could drop me an email, that would be really helpful. Apologies, I'm sounding quite new and naive, but yeah, I'm proud that you actually try to work through the backlog. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'll do that. Thank you. And thank you very much for all the interesting questions. I always absolutely love it when people like complaints and talk about complaints. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris, and just a couple of comments or observations from me. I'm a bit like Paola, that I've dealt with complaints in my professional career and always have seen them as a positive, because they tend to shine a spotlight on an area perhaps where it isn't getting the management attention perhaps it needs. And actually, like Paola said, actually, if you deal with a complaint well, not only do you have a very satisfied resident, but invariably they turn into advocates of the council. So there's a really positive outcome that can be achieved if we do deal with them well. I share James's concerns around the communication that went through the waste team when we were having the problems, and there still are some areas where there are problems there. I'm pleased to see that you've picked up with the customer standards. You're going to bring a draft of that to us. And if perhaps I could ask on behalf of the committee, you liaise with Nicola about when it would be appropriate to bring that forward. I would also ask that we make sure that there is active involvement and engagement of councillors in the development of that draft. Because actually, as my colleagues have shown you this morning, we do tend to deal with this a fair bit. So it would be daft not to pick up on that intelligence and insight that perhaps we can provide as well, in terms of trying to make that the best document that you can. But I think that's it. So if you can come back to us on the customer standards, obviously you'll bring your full report later in the year, and we'll pick that up when we look at the agenda plan towards the end of the meeting. But just thank colleagues for their contributions. Thank you, Chris, for...
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, what I'll try and do is, if it times well, I might be able to get the draft over for the next corporate governance and audit meeting, so that it can kind of be done in the same session.
Yeah, I'll say, if you can liaise with Nicola, and we'll fit that in where it feels appropriate.
Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
If everybody's comfortable, we'll move on to agenda item 7, which... Oh, sorry, I've already got it wrong as a chair. I knew this had happened. We just need to formally note the report as a committee, if we're all comfortable with that. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nicola. I will get there. Right, I will move on then. And I think, is James presenting the next one? Or is Rachel? Rachel, are you joining us?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me.
Yep.
Yep, so my name is Rachel Firth, and I'm Finance Manager in the Central Team, and I manage the production of the annual Statement of Accounts and the Council's Treasury. So for the new members, there are 3 Treasury reports that come to this committee, a 6-monthly, outturn and a strategy. So this is the annual report highlighting the activity of the Treasury for the year. So the Council operated within the strategy approved by Council in March 23, keeping cash around 30 million in secure liquid investments in order to manage day-to-day cash flows. There was an underspend of 6.1 million against a Treasury budget of 21.9. And again, for new members of the committee who might be new to Treasury, the figures may seem a bit startling at the beginning until you get used to what actually goes in the reports and the size of the numbers. So I'll just run through it. Investments, they averaged 59.9 million, earning an average interest rate of 5.26%. Investment balances were higher than our usual levels due to the timing of taking some long-term loans, which resulted in healthy cash balances at certain times of the year. Excuse me. The majority was placed in instant access deposit accounts, such as money market funds, and the DMO, which is Debt Management Office, which is part of HM Treasury. The Council has got 10 million invested in the CCLA Property Fund, which returned a gross dividend yield of 3.6%. And at the end of March 24, the Council's investments totalled 39.1 million. The high bank rates were good for investment returns, as short-dated cash rates were high. Short-term rates peaked at 5.7 for 3 months, although quickly began to decline. Money market rates also rose and were between 3.98% at the start of the year and 5.27 at the end of the year. There is a section in the report from our external advisors, Arling Close, who provide commentary on the economy. So I will go through it as it does affect what the Council can borrow at. UK inflation continued to decline from the 8.7% at the start of the year, and by March, headline inflation had fallen to 3.4. And the latest data released last week showed continuing decline to 2%, which is the same level as the Bank of England's target. The Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, which is the MPC, increased bank rate from 4.25% at the start of the year to 4.25 to 5.25 in August. And it has remained at that rate throughout the year to March, and at the most recent MPC meeting earlier this month, it maintained the same rate. Uncertainty continued in financial markets and gilt yields remained volatile. Arlene Close maintained their view that 5.25% remains the peak in the bank rate and that interest rates will likely start to be cut later in the second half of 2024. So borrowing, the cost of both long and short-term borrowing remained high. Interest rates have seen substantial rises over the last 2 years, although these rates have now started to level off. So the cost of short-term borrowing from other local authorities generally rose with base rate. The Public Works Loan Board, the PWLB, which is part of government's HM Treasury Department, is the council's main source of borrowing. So PWLB rates were very volatile throughout the year. So borrowing was taken when opportunities arose and the gilt yields dipped. A new HRA rate was made available from June last year, and it's available till June 25, which is 0.4% below the certainty rate we can get from the PWLB. This discounted rate is to support local authorities borrowing for the delivery of social housing or refinancing existing HRA loans. So in terms of the borrowing activity, total external borrowing increased by 93.5 million to 707.3 million, which is shown in tables 1 and 2. The increase is due to approximately 48 million of borrowing to fund the capital plan and 50 use of internal balances, such as usable reserves and working capital. The council repaid 48.6 million of long-term loans and converted 40.6 of temporary borrowing into fixed rate loans. And by the end of the year, had 41.4 million of temporary borrowing. The weighted average borrowing rate in 23-24 for all loans was 4.19%. The council took 190 million of new long-term borrowing from the PWLB in 23-24, and these loans were taken throughout the year in tranches of equal instalment of principal and a few maturity loans, and those are shown in paragraph 2.6.4. An EIP loan pays back the principal over the life of the loan, and then the interest associated with the loan goes down as the principal outstanding reduces, whereas a maturity loan pays back the full amount at a set date in the future. The profile for all long-term loans is shown in Appendix 3 and shows that no more than 8.4% of debt is due to be repaid in any 1 year, which is good practice as it reduces the council's exposure to substantial borrowing in any one future year. The council repaid 30.6 million of LOBOs and continues to hold another 30 million of LOBOs. These are where the lender has the option to propose an increase in the rates at set dates. Following that, the council has the option to either accept the rate or repay the loan at no additional cost. And during the year, there were 3 banks that exercised this option. They increased their rates during the period, hence the loans were repaid, and they were replaced with 3 lots of 10 million PWLB rates. And a portfolio of short and long term was maintained throughout the period as per the strategy. I'll just mention a bit about the capital financing. So that the CFR, which is the capital financing requirement, is the underlying need to fund capital expenditure via borrowing. So the council has an increase in CFR due to the capital programme and consequently increase in borrowing requirements. So you can see at the Appendix 5 is the liability benchmark. This is now one of the Treasury Management prudential indicators that has to be reported quarterly in the normal outturns, in the council's outturn reports. So it shows the CFR increasing compared to current borrowing and highlights the borrowing required. And in the chart, the gap between the dark grey and the liability benchmark shows the shortfall in funds that the council will need to borrow. However, unfortunately, I said previously, borrowing does remain high. We do cash flow forecasting to make borrowing decisions, which tries to avoid unnecessary borrowing, which can lead to some costs of carry and other investment risks. The council will continue to take a mixture of long and short term when opportunities in rates arise, and in consultation with our Treasury advisors, Arlene Close. So that was a brief highlight of the main points of the report. If anybody's got any comments or questions, happy to take them.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll open up to committee members first. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Thanks for making your really detailed report so simple in your presentation. I've got 4 questions. I'll ask them in 2 tranches because it'll help my phrasing, if nothing else. So the first one's to do with paragraph 110 and MRP. And it might just be, it almost certainly is just my understanding, but I couldn't quite get my head around how we went from an over-provision of 34.2 million to an in-year in-wind of 6.3 million. So can you just explain to me what's going on there and whether that means we've got another 28 million to unwind at some future stage?
Yeah, so during the year we had the Section 151 officer at the time wanted us to commission a piece of work by independent consultants to review the MRP that's been calculated since the previous review. The policy hasn't changed, but what they have done is looked at the workings and have recalculated that MRP. So in total, they've identified 34 million. This year, we could only take 6 million because you can't have a negative MRP. So the MRP calculation was around 20 million for the year. 13 of that is a previous over provision that we've previously used, leaving a 6 million. So that's why the Treasury budget was under by the 6 million. So there is further MRP savings over the next couple of years.
So I suppose it's quite difficult to go through it here, and perhaps it's for some other people. It just feels concerning that the council's used someone external to create this opportunity. I think that has an impact on budgets and things going forward as well, doesn't it? So it's a sort of accounting adjustment that accountants like me sometimes like, but they can't go on forever. So I suppose it's just whether we all understand and the council understands the full impact of that. It just feels a bit unusual for a Chief Financial Officer to get someone in to help with that sort of thing. So as long as it's consistent with the policy, and you said it is, I guess we're comforted by that.
What they've done is they've taken the MRP that we calculate each year, and we normally calculate MRP based on the asset lives of the that we borrowed for, and they've done, and that specific asset lives, so it could be 20, it could be 30, it could be 50, they've like averaged it out over the period and done an average life of the assets. So that's where it's come from. But yes, the MRP writes down the CFR over time, over the 50 years time. So this is sort of pushing the MRP further down the years. You can't change the CFR because that's already been calculated. So this is more MRP to be paid later.
I think I'll wait for now, and I think it's a conversation that I need to perhaps go through in some detail so I get my understanding right, but it must have an impact on future budgets and the financial sustainability question, which is a big issue for the council, isn't it? I
think it's a shame we haven't got our external accountants with us today, because I know it's MRP is something they've looked at a number of times, and it's probably one where perhaps at a subsequent meeting we might want to ask them to have a comment on, really.
Yeah.
And perhaps if Rachel, if we could pick that up, perhaps.
Yeah, just to say we have spoken to the external auditors about the approach we took last year, and obviously Kevin Mulvaney, our new Section 151 officer, permanent 151 officer, he's obviously up to speed with all of that. He's unfortunately, well, not unfortunately for him, he's in Norfolk this week, so he would have been here. So we're happy to discuss that at a future meeting, no problem.
Chris, come back to you.
So my second group of questions are about Treasury Management Prudential Indicators. And again, this is all second year round, new to me in a sense. So first, the first question was you talked about the liability benchmark. And in my mind, I was expecting a benchmark to say this is about as high as you can afford to go, whereas this really just measures a gap. So is there something in Treasury Management guidance or council policies that says whether 828.9 million is affordable, and what's the impact of that on other things, given what you said about high interest rates? On the maturity structure of borrowing, clearly we stand within the upper and lower limits, but it is relatively heavily distorted towards 10 years and above. So I just wondered if that was a deliberate policy. Clearly we've got quite a lot of capacity to have shorter borrowing if we wanted. And lastly, a similar question really about interest at fixed rate as a percentage of net interest payments. We're very heavily skewed towards fixed rates, all of which fits with the policy that's described in the document, but we do feel to be kind of edging towards one end, both in terms of length of loans and fixed rates. And I don't know if that's a kind of deliberate policy or something that just emerges over time. And again, some understanding of the risk and consequences of that. I think the committee is all about risk, isn't it? So understanding what that means for the council going forward would be useful.
Yeah, I'll just go back to your first point then on the limits. We do have authorised limits. We have operational boundaries and authorised limits, and those are set at the beginning of the year for the Treasury strategy. Those are reported as part of the Treasury Management indicators. Those are also reported quarterly now. So those are the limit. The operational boundary becomes a point where if our borrowing becomes close to that, it can go above it, but it can be around that area. It's the authorised boundary that really, if the authority is creeping up to that, then that should set alarm bells ringing. Yeah, but those are quoted in the outturn report. In terms of the maturity structure, yes, if you look at that chart tells us maybe we should be taking some, sort of fixed maturity type loans that might mature in 24, 42, 43. So taking loans around that time. The loans that we've been taking at the moment are at the bottom of the yield curve. So it's more cost effective for us to take them at that point. And we do EIP, so we are paying them over. We're repaying them every year. So that's not going to be in 40, 50 years' time. Those loans were a lot more expensive, so we have taken them in line to meet our Treasury budget.
Thanks, Rachel.
I think it's just a bit about the fixed versus the variable.
On the fixed. Well, yeah, we fixed in the rates because then we just haven't got that refinancing risk. We've got a less amount this year than we had last year of temporary borrowing. That temporary borrowing always needs to be repaid, and you've got a financing risk there. Will the cash be available? Will it not be available? Will it be at really high rates? So we try and fix in some of that rates so it's a bit more stable. The interest costs are more stable for us as well.
Chris? Yeah.
That's fine. I mean, I just think 95.5 is at the extreme end of that kind of policy range, so I think it's just something to keep an eye on. But you've got access to all the information about yield curves and the like, so I accept it is how we are, but it does feel at one end of the range that the limits allow us to go to. And if that's the decision we've come to, that's fine. I'm not going to second guess it retrospectively because that's not not fair, but it just seems a bit odd, so that's why I raised it. But thank you for the answer.
James, did you want to comment?
Morning, everyone. For those that I haven't met before, I'm James Anderson, Head of Accountancy. I work with Rachel. So it's probably just to pick up on a few of those points. Hope I haven't missed any. In terms of the MRP, it has been shared with external audit and we engaged fully with them. We do expect it will form part of their audit work this year. In terms of why we use an external body, it's just that expertise. When we did one, what it was probably 17, 18, when the last MRP review was done, it was done by Arlene Close, who are our current Treasury advisors. But when Isabel came, she just wanted Link to have a look at it. They use a slightly different methodology to do these things, and she just wanted some assurance whether there was anything that, when they apply their methodology, whether it would have a benefit for us. So that's how that came about. And I'd say, when it comes to the audit, external audit will look at whether it meets our policy and it's compliant with the code. So that's in a technical sense. Are we doing anything wrong? And they'll obviously report back as part of their audit. We've asked this question of Link, and we're satisfied with their answers and that we are code compliant. So we don't think there'll be any issues on that side. What might happen is there may be reference in the VFM section, because they previously referenced some of these things in there, and that looks at that kind of long-term view, as you said, the budgeting side and it going forward, and that's where it may come out, because obviously it's about this fundamentally, MRP is about the repayment of debt and the timings of which you do that, which should mirror your assets. And so it could there could be a reference in that section, and that's where we'd expect to see something. In terms of borrowing and affordability, Rachel's probably given you a pretty good answer there. The thing to re-emphasise is that comes in when we look at our prudential indicators and that net revenue cost as a proportion of the budget, and feeding those revenue costs, the borrowing costs into the revenue budget. So we'll find that our Treasury budget goes up on the back of increased borrowing and an increased percentage interest charge for that borrowing. So that is done. And when we do our Treasury budgets over a 5-year period, where we look at the borrowing and the borrowing costs and do some sensitivity analysis on that. So that's where that kind of manifests itself. But that key prudential indicator is now, as part of the prudential code, it does go into the quarterly reporting. So it's in one of those slides that are part of that slide pack that goes to Cabinet and gets published. The other bit in terms of the maturity, Rachel, again, sorry, covering most things, but the conversations, when we get to the point that we need to borrow, we have a conversation with Arlene Close, the Treasury advisors, to look at maturity profiles and all the other things, and it's a conversation with them. So it's born out of that, and they look again at borrowing need as we project forward, and they give us a nice little graph, and they kind of tell us well in advance, look, we'd expect you to borrow in at this kind of maturity level. So all it ever is a tweak at the margin, and Rachel's right, a lot of it's about finding the value within a set period. So we may say we want to borrow over 10 to 20 years, and we will find the right maturity that gives us the best deal, because every 6 months we'll have a different rate attached to it when we borrow from PWLB. So we pick the right one. In terms of fixed versus variable, we go for fixed because of the certainty, fundamentally. And it allows us to budget properly, and we know what we're doing. So that's the reason why there's a heavy weight in there. We haven't done it for a long time, but when there was a lot of short-term borrowing, that we treated that almost more as variable, because it might be for a week or it might be for a month, and it's a lot of local authority to local authority borrowing, and it used to be incredibly cheap. It would be barely over 0%, and we had a large portfolio of that. But in recent years, when interest rates have been particularly volatile, we took a decision that we didn't want to be in that space anymore. We needed to start fixing in some borrowing. Obviously, as the borrowing need became higher, as reserves go down, as you spend more on capital, that all requires borrowing. And leaving it in a volatile market to short-term borrow was just felt a bit too risky. So we've, again, in conjunction with Treasury advisors and Section 151 officers, we made the call to be a bit more proactive in terms of our borrowing and to not leave that element of risk. So as interest rates drop down and that local authority to local authority borrowing becomes having a bit more value, if you like, for us, we might well dip back in. But again, it's one that's constantly under review, and we do see that as more the variable element of our borrowing. The longer term stuff, we do tend to want to just have the certainty so we can budget properly. I think hopefully I've covered all of those points, especially for you, Chris. So if there's any I've missed, let me know and I'll have another go. Thank you.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Any other members got any questions? Okay, I think we're happy with that. Just to let members know that this will be going forward to Cabinet and to Council in July. So we're just being asked to note the report if people are happy with that. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Rachel and James. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we will move on to our next agenda item, which is the draft governance statement. And we have Simon. Simon.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Sorry, I can't be with you in person as normal. So this is the draft annual governance statement for 23-24 for members' information, comment and to note. I think, as we've already established, there are some new members on the committee now. So if it would be helpful, I'll just run through an outline of the background and purpose of the AGS before we come on to the actual document itself. So I suppose the main points to note are that it's a statutory requirement and has been for many years. The statement accompanies the annual accounts as published, so it will be a public document and it will shortly be available, or the draft will be for public inspection. It's a corporate document, it's not an audit one, so in that sense I'm the messenger rather than the author. It's really owned by the Chief Executive and the leader. And it largely follows a SITFA SOLIS template. The main purpose of the document is to provide readers of the accounts with assurance about both the governance and the internal control environment in which they've been compiled and to which they relate. The statement itself covers the period up until the accounts are formally approved, so at some stage later this year, 24-25. So whilst it primarily covers last financial year, 23-24, it should also reflect any significant changes in the intervening period as well. So I guess that's why it's a draft now, really. The statement reflects an annual review of the effectiveness of both the governance and control arrangements, and that review has incorporated various forms of assurance, many of which come to this committee during the year as well. So that's essentially the Head of Internal Audit's annual report, the work of Grant Thornton as external auditors, and annual reports from various activities such as customer standards we've been hearing about earlier. So the draft's been through a fairly thorough consultation process with Chief Finance Officer, Monitoring Officer, Directors and ELT with Chief Exec. The statement typically gives an overall opinion on the governance arrangements, together with details of what are called significant governance issues. And those, or their inclusion or otherwise, is largely based on sit for solace criteria. And that's essentially the crux of the statement. Although perhaps it's arguably more an art rather than a science. The nature of several of these issues is such that they often need longer than 1 year to be addressed fully. So the annual review process determines whether sufficient progress has been made for them to be considered and effectively to have returned to a business as usual mode. Thereafter, a quarterly monitoring process updates the ELT and this committee on progress made during the year and on issues and actions in the draft itself until it's finalised because of the time lag. So I think that's the gist of a potted summary of the document itself. As to the 23-24 draft, well, the first thing to note is that the opinion on the cover page basically concludes that overall the arrangements continue to be both robust and fit for purpose and to comply with the council's own local code of corporate governance. The significant governance issues included in last year's statement, the 22-23 one, of which there were 8 at that time. The review process has concluded that 5 really have been determined to be sufficiently addressed so that, as I say, they can be viewed as having returned to a business as usual mode. And those ones are shown in the first blue table on page 4 of the draft, with a summary of the reasons and progress made. The remaining 3, it's been concluded, still require further time for the various remediation measures to become embedded. And those are described in the second blue table on page 5, together with further action planned and proposed. And those are, unsurprisingly, the overall financial position of the council, plus the need to meet building safety or residential building safety standards with the social housing regulator, and the management and use of data across the organisation in key decision-making processes. Then finally, on page 10, a third blue table identifies 3 new issues that have been identified through the review process that arguably meet the criteria for inclusion. And just to note those, they are the need for a formal review of our own local code of corporate governance itself, the need to comply and monitor notification of reportable accidents to the HSE, and thirdly, to work to meet a range of statutory timeframes given the current labour market and the current resources of the council, an example of which I think we referred to earlier was around SEND assessment planning. A summary of proposed actions from management is also included in that table. So that essentially is the draft as it stands at the moment. I think the timeframe for publication for public inspection is fairly tight. I think Rachel's keen to get on with that shortly. So whether there is sufficient time to incorporate further comments or changes, thoughts from today, I'm not sure, but certainly we can reflect anything further in the monitoring process and certainly in the finalised version later in the year, which will probably need updating, if only to reflect timing issues. So that's all I have to say, I think. So back to you, Chair, with happy to answer any comments, queries, questions as best I can.
Thanks, Simon. I'll open up to the panel. Does anyone any James?
Yeah, I suppose it's a general comment thinking about what sort of one of the items here, but also sort of potentially new issues. So, obviously we've got stuff about we've got the item about robust governance, oversight, management, and the delivery of change for a balanced budget and so on. And, you know, some of the things, for example, it says in there, it talks about regular reporting through ELT, Cabinet taking corrective actions where necessary. I'm not sure whether the council has a functioning Cabinet at the moment. And it did just make me wonder then when we get onto new risks, there's nothing that reflects there about the governance of the council. I mean, the leader of the council's not here today. I don't know whether, when I looked on the council website earlier, it says under finance that there's no Cabinet member responsible for finance. I don't know if she views that she is responsible for it. But I'm just wondering, is that something that needs to be considered in this report, or is a new risk until that situation's resolved? I don't know, obviously, what the intentions are, but it just seems concerning to me that obviously we have things like saying Cabinet will take actions to correct things, but you know, the last Cabinet meeting was cancelled and so on. So I'm just trying to wonder if that needs to be part of this, on this, as a new and emerging risk on here.
Simon, would you like to comment on that?
Well, subject to what any other colleagues in the room might want to say, I think the arrangements, if there are any changes to the arrangements, that probably ought to be reflected in the statement for the period that they apply. As to non-compliance issues, similarly too, but I don't think there's anybody here from the governance team on the call, is there, to help me out?
We have got Lee here.
Oh, sorry.
You just can't see him. He's hiding.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'll be guided by what colleagues might think. As I say, the period of the statement runs up until the account, so it should reflect the actuality of what's happening now and potentially into the future as well. So,
yeah, I'm happy to come in, Chair. Just from a governance perspective, we do have a functioning Cabinet. What happened at AGM happened at AGM. In terms of the decision-making processes, there's nothing that's happened that has stopped decisions being taken. As I say, in terms of a functioning Cabinet, you need a leader and 2 members. One of them does have to have a statutory responsibility for children. That's in place. There are vacancies within the Cabinet based on the previous portfolios. But as I say, in terms of process, there's nothing that prevents things happening. I accept it's not normal in a sense, you know, but we are operating as a business as usual in terms of decision making. That's pretty much where we're at.
Thanks, Lee. I think what we're saying is that, if anything, it's potentially something that may be a risk rather than a governance process issue. But it may be one that we ask Martin to comment on later. But it's probably not for the governance statement as such. But I agree with you about concerns that's underlying your comment, to be honest, James.
Yeah, thank you. Just I'm happy if it's not part of this agenda item as such. But yeah, I just wanted to raise that. Yeah.
Only very briefly, Chair, just to say, yes, this is about, there's a bit of a thing about process, and then there's a sort of statement about what's at risk, and the risk area is the issue about achieving the savings and the process for that. If it starts to substantially stymie the achievement by nature of not being able to get things through council or whatever, that's where the issue of the governance comes. So it's, for the moment, we've got to give chance for this process to see whether it works or not, but there may well be a consequence. So it may be that by the time we get to this being more finalised, or as we move along, we feel we need to make some amendments to this, because it clearly would be an issue that the Chief Executive, I think, would probably need to report to Council if it was resulting in the fact that we were so mired in the ability to make the core decisions that were necessary. So it's part of that. So it's a link particularly to the finance, but it's all of them really, but the finance one is the core one. So I think the position at the moment is we can't make that judgment, it might be that in a few weeks' time, or certainly at the time that the annual report, that the accounts are published, that we need to recognise this.
Okay, thank you. Denver, Chris, you wanted to come in?
I was going to raise in a slightly different way, I think the point James raised. So as an independent member looking from outside, it feels like the control environment of the council in general can't possibly be as robust as it was in previous years, and that isn't reflected in this report much at all, and it feels to me it might be. And that's not just about the AGM and political change, but I think a council that's been through 4 Section 151 officers in the 12 months I've been here needs to reflect on what that might mean for its control environment as well. It might mean nothing, but in here it's a strength that the senior leadership team's now stabilised. It doesn't feel it might be a bit soon for that, but that's a kind of general point. It is interesting that the signatories to this report are advised by this committee on the conclusion that it reaches, so it's quite important. I think the committee, the voting members of the committee are comfortable the report, when it's finalised, is an accurate reflection of how they see governance arrangements, and I'm certainly happy to express a view when we get to that stage, even though I'm not a voting member. And I suppose the other thing for me on that comment about governance arrangements, the council's had for the last 2 years very negative comments about financial sustainability in the value for money section of the external audit report, which to me doesn't sit comfortably with the overall conclusion. I think, 1, you might get away with, 2, I think starts to look a bit nervous, and so this is a 3rd, I think we'd have to reflect very carefully if the governance arrangements were adequate, because if the outcomes aren't right, then the government arrangements can't be effective. You can't continue to say the systems are okay if the outcomes aren't right, it seems to me. There's a few specific points, so it's great to see new members on the committee. There's a sentence in here about training for members of the audit committee, and that being part of the governance arrangements. I mean, I've been a member now for 12 months. I've had 1 piece of training, which was on treasury management, so hopefully new colleagues will have some training at some point on the work of the committee, because that seems to me important.
Just comment on that. We've got a discussion about training to be had at the end of this meeting.
But more, both more general and more specific, I kind of feel for Simon having to present this report. I've said it at previous stage, actually. It feels to me the actions in many cases aren't actions. It's very generic. I was reading a document for something to do about good practice in governance in local government, and it specifically says the government statement should be really specific. It should avoid generic statements. Even those items that have been resolved, it's really hard to see what the learning is, and what we've really done and what we've learned from it, and how they've actually been resolved. So something like partnerships, appropriate management oversight has helped ensure delivery of key priorities and community needs. That's such a big statement. It'd be great if we could say that with confidence, but I doubt if many of us could. And if we look in the current and the new risks, there's lots of statements in the actions that aren't actions at all. And I think this is a comment I made on last year's. So I think it's time really to make this a bit sharper, was my personal view.
I'm smiling because the comment you just made about the partnerships one was one I picked up in the chairman's brief on Monday. Exactly the same point, Chris, that if you read this, it doesn't tell you anything. And I've already asked that they look at the wording of these to sharpen them up for us. So I think your point is very well made. I don't know whether you want to make any further comment on that, Simon, at all.
No, well, can echo your comments regarding Chair's briefing. I'm certainly in agreement with Chris in terms of the need for specifics. In some cases, I suppose the nature of some of the issues is so potentially wide-ranging that in a relatively concise document, it's sometimes hard to balance the need for specifics and yet have a concise document. But we'll certainly go back with those comments through to ELT and the Chief Exec, certainly for the finalised version, and as I say, for quarterly monitoring purposes as well.
Yeah, thank you. I just the comments that have just been made pick up on what I wanted to comment on, which is a lot of the actions in the action plans are statements rather than actions. We should do this, we must do this. And where there are actions, it would be useful if there was like timescales for that. If it's just very woolly. And I understand that there is a detailed action plan behind all of that, where hopefully that is all logged and, you know, an action plan. But it would be more helpful to have when the intended closure would be for these, and we could see the completion dates. So not much of an action plan, it's more of a statement of intent. Thank you.
I'm smiling again because these are comments we've made across the chamber in the past on other documents, isn't it? That they come forward with statements and with no dates or actions attached to them. One thing I did say in the chair's briefing is I'd like to monitor this through this year. So have more regular updates of what action's being taken, what progress is being made against these items, so this becomes a bit more of a living document for us, because we're the ones that are charged with making sure that the governance is in place and is appropriate. So I'll continue to sort of chip away at that with officers and bring things back. I don't know if anyone else wanted to comment at all on that. Or, oh, Martin wants to come in, and Rachel.
I'll say the same thing. Essentially, we have. I think we are committed. I think you know your suggestion then, Chair, that we do some monitoring that enables us to actually say where we think, if we think we've made progress, and actually to also go along with the points that were made by Mr. Jones to try to sort of sharpen it up so that we can say, well, we've finished this, we have done this one now, or we are doing that. It also enables us to actually check on the comments that are made by Councillor Homewood about whether the governance is, you know, the current uncertainties in the organisation's governance, which, you know, may or may not get resolved in the medium and the short term. We will then see whether this is having an impact on the ability to deliver the objectives in here. So, yeah, so if we do some monitoring for Q2, which should come back at or about the same time as the earliest that the auditors are going to be recommending this to you, then hopefully we can get these two aligned at that particular point. So at least you've seen what the outcomes were from the. So I think, Chair, one of our suggestions was that you sort of resolve as part of this exercise that you ask us to adopt the draft document with its shortcomings and ask us to monitor the progress against that, and that enables us to then and also look at the points that Councillor Davies made, that, you know, it's a little bit that there is supposed to be some detail behind it, so we need to sort of get to that bottom of that and then bring it out and try to bring it out the more core points. And we'll also look to correct some things. I think some of the areas of issues with, it's all quite subtle, this, isn't it? It's a sort of bureaucrat speak, because the issues about partnerships probably originates from the time when there were concerns that the integrated care arrangements with the NHS weren't necessarily going to work, and I think that they've become more embedded now, and hence that. But I think Councillor Mr. Jones is right in pointing out, it doesn't actually say that, it just uses these sort of euphemistic words. So, yeah.
Rachel?
Yeah, sorry, my point was actually going to be about your point about the finance one, and just to say that obviously the external auditors will be here next time in terms of getting some assurance that what we've put matches obviously what they're looking at through their process to look at VFM this year.
Yeah, I think it just needs to be sharper so it's clear about what governance actions are being taken. And it's fantastic that all the community's key priorities and needs are being met. That's great news, isn't it? We can sleep easily now.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Chair. Alice Carruthers. I'm a corporate risk lead. So I don't intend to walk through the two documents that have been provided. I'm sure there will be a number of questions which I'm happy to answer. But what I will do is position these as part of our ongoing activity to reinforce the Council's risk management framework and how they sit within that. So the risk management policy replaces the risk management statement, which was dated 2018. So was due for a review. This is a strategic document and sets out at a high level why we value risk management, what it is we do to make sure we are doing it effectively, and what the benefits are organisation-wide of doing it well. It includes details around the high-level roles and responsibilities of specific role holders and governance routes within the organisation. And it also sets some high-level expectations around how we will address risk appetite, risk culture and risk maturity assessment across the Council. It also notes that this will be subject to annual review moving forward, so we don't find ourselves in the position that we have currently. The second document, the risk management strategy and guidance document, is more of an operational document, which is to support those who are implementing the risk management framework, and contains details of how we implement it. It's guidance for those that are completing risk registers, that are identifying risks, to provide guidance on whether these need to be escalated to a corporate level or can be managed at a service level, for example, how you might score risks, and what would be appropriate controls and mitigants that could be put in place. So it does not necessarily need to come to this forum for approval, but I think because it's its first iteration, it's useful for you to see the two documents together at this point. The report also just flags the progress that we're making in terms of defining the organisation's risk appetite statement, because that is referenced in the documents. So that is work that is underway at the moment, that was commenced at the beginning of this of 24-25, and we're looking to progress that with appropriate kind of engagement and consultation moving forward the rest of this year. Happy to take any questions.
I can open that to the floor. Any comments? Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's really good. Thank you for bringing it. It's really clear. Hopefully colleagues in the council can see it in that way and use it. It's just a couple of really minor points where I think the policy leaves open options, which might be deliberate or might not be. So on page 6 of the policy, it says it may be appropriate for large or diverse directors to maintain risk registers at service level, which is eminently sensible. I just wondered whether it might be helpful to give colleagues some criteria or some thoughts as to what might help them decide whether they do or don't need them at service level. It just leaves it a bit open, doesn't it, which might well be the intention. And on page 9, up at the top there, portfolio holders. I don't think it's for me to tell portfolios what they should do, but I think that phrase suggested quarterly. I mean, either it is quarterly or it isn't. So I can't see why you wouldn't just say undertake a risk review quarterly and leave it with colleagues to do it, but the minor details really.
Okay, thank you. I think just with your first point in terms of service and directorate, we have some established working relationships and risk registers at both of those levels that are working effectively. So what we didn't want to do was put in a policy that took us a step back, but I think going forward, guidance around where we should be targeting to get to is useful. So take that on board. Thank you.
James?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for sharing the documents. I know we've kind of discussed and asked to see more detail like this before, so it's good to see. Just one query on the risk management strategy and guidance. When it goes into risk assessment, there's a bit I'm just kind of not quite getting, because under the inherent risk assessment, it says the inherent risk is scored assuming legal and statutory requirements are adhered to without taking into consideration of any additional mitigations or controls. why would it always be scored assuming legal and statutory requirements are met? Because obviously they might not be. And actually, when you look at the impact, one of them is legal compliance regulation, where you can score it as severe breaches in statutory duty. So I don't think the description of the inherent risk is correct there. I understand what you're saying, which is you don't, and you say it earlier, you don't score a worst case scenario of not planning to adhere to any regulation, but it gives the impression that you would never accept or score inherent risk as not being, being non-compliant or being a legal breach, and I think that must be incorrect.
Yeah, I think that's a fair challenge. I think Martin would use a seatbelt analogy in this case, and I think we've probably included that previously to address what you've picked up in terms of we don't want to have a worst case scenario, so people scoring inherent risks, assuming we don't have any frameworks, any guidance in place, we don't have any legal review, we don't have, and that isn't it's not a position that we would find ourselves in at all. So I think I'll take the point and go back and have a look at that. I think that would be useful.
Yeah, because I think just to tweak, because I'm sure that's not what's happening, because obviously if we're looking at like the housing risk and we've got guidance from regulators saying there's a problem here, there we're not going, oh, well, we'll score the inherent risk is compliant for that, when we know that we've been challenged on it and had findings. It's just, if someone was reading that guidance, I think they could construe it the wrong way. I think probably in practice they're doing it, that wouldn't happen, but it's just to make sure the guidance kind of links with what you would expect to see.
Mike, you mentioned the seatbelt analogy. It might be useful to try and give a couple of examples in there that helps people understand the nuance of that.
Yeah,
yep.
I think that, yes, the argument has been you don't start from the point of people injuring themselves because they aren't wearing a seatbelt because statute says they're supposed to do it, just like you don't start from the position whereby you let random people drive your lorries because you can't actually let them do that. You have to be a lorry driver. But you're absolutely right, Councillor Homewood, that we have got ourselves into a position where we are being told that we are not even legally compliant in relation to some areas, like some issues in relation to damp and mould. So yeah, you have to actually take that into account, but if you are starting from that absolute point, but it's really about the inherent risk not being some kind of theoretical position you can never ever get yourself, you should never get yourself to. But if you start from a point where you are already non-compliant, then you do have to start exactly at that particular point. Yeah.
Because it's about our journey in terms of managing risk better, isn't it? And so thank you for the work that you've put into this, and I'm sure it'll be well received across the council as well as we embed it. I note that what we're being asked to do is to agree the statement, which I think we're doing. There was a couple of comments there that I'm glad you're able to pick up and address. And just to remind members that the risk appetite statement that's underway will eventually come through and will be going to Cabinet and Council for approval. Yeah? Everybody happy? Well, thank you with that. So thank you, Alice. We're on to our last agenda item, which is at the back of your pack, agenda item 10, which was our first attempt at a plan of agendas through the year. So this is something we talked about last year. Those members who were members of the committee last year, that it was to give us a bit of a forward look at what's likely to come in, what orders, and does that make sense to members of the committee? Are we receiving information at the right time? Are there agenda items that if we had them on the same agenda, it would feel more comfortable and we can have a more informed discussion? I don't know whether people have an opportunity to look at that. There is one change that we're being asked to make. So in the July meeting, the third agenda item, the bad debt write-off, officers are now saying they won't have it ready for that date. So we're going to move that one to the September meeting, but I don't think that's particularly a problem. This is a draft. This is what we will be proceeding with unless we decide as a committee to do something different. So if people do have any observations or comments on it, happy to take them now or later. If you reflect on something, actually, it might be better for us if we did something in a slightly different way. Are people okay with that? Right, there are two other things I wanted to mention today before we finish. One, and as Chris alluded earlier, is around training. We did agree last year that we wanted to provide a bit more training for members of this committee, and we are getting some support from some of our governance officers and from the auditors to come and provide some of that training. The dates don't align. The dates of our meetings don't align with when that training can be delivered. So Nicola will be contacting us and asking us if we can come up with some dates where the majority of us can get together and undertake that training. So it will be done in a session outside one of our formal meetings. At our next meeting, we are going to be asked to do a bit of a self-assessment around how we feel governance and audit is working. Now, except for new members, you're not going to have an awful lot, perhaps to say. The initial idea was to do it today, and I said, well, that's far too early. But hopefully you'll learn something from it anyway. And those of us who have been around a bit, if I can say that politely, hopefully we'll be able to contribute a little bit more to that assessment. And I think, Martin, is that part of our general governance that it's a best practice, isn't it, to...
Switching my microphone on, Chair.
I just wonder whether it's possible for colleagues to send us 2 or 3 kind of thought-provoking questions so we can do some thinking around the self-evaluation before we get here.
Yeah, we probably need to. We'll try to find a sort of Aunt Sally. These are the sort of things you should ask questions about and share it around. And there are various ones produced by. I'm not sure the LDA has produced one, but certainly I think Grant Thornton, one of the big accountancy firms, have produced something. So it starts from those positions, and I think that's a perfectly valid point. So we'll make sure that that's done and circulated around in advance. So yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Are there any other questions for anyone? Well, can I just thank you all for being kind to me in my first meeting, and thank you for your contributions. And we'll close the meeting there. Thank you.